that kind of leads us maybe to the next topic, which would be about tracking. Tracking our foods has been an interest of yours for a long time, and trying to create scales and numbers of, and trying to like capture the quality of a certain food so that we can make easy recommendations for people that they can understand as far as knowing how to consume their food. What are some of the benefits of having trackers and scores and scales and things like that, and what are some of the drawbacks?
So one of the benefits is that you tend to learn something. You might not necessarily anticipate what you're going to learn, but you do tend to learn some interesting things when you pay attention, because tracking is just paying attention in a way that's sort of objective and that you're not fooling yourself. Because we're very bad at recalling what we've eaten. We tend to exaggerate. In fact, it's quite interesting. People who are obese tend to have worse food recall than people who are lean, probably because their appetite is dysregulated. So it's harder to keep track of what they're eating. Now, that being said, yes, it is educational. Yes, you can figure out some hints of what you're actually doing. You can get an objective picture, which is great. It can be really good, but it has huge drawbacks, and it's also not the goal. It's not what we want people to be doing for the rest of their lives. So I think I see it as a tool. And the reason why I think it's worth doing is because the way we're currently tracking food is basically we're tracking calorie intake, maybe grams of fiber. We're trying to limit our saturated fat intake if we listen to government guidelines. We're making sure we're eating, quote, a balanced diet, whatever that means. For some people, that could mean you need a certain amount of carbs, fat, and protein. So there's a lot of confusion in what we should be tracking. And that's where the pitfalls, are basically. If we know what we need to track, then it can be useful. If we're tracking the wrong stuff, then that can be worse than not tracking at all. And that's where I think the scales we use are really, really important. So when I launched my first business venture, which now doesn't exist anymore, it was Nutrita. And the goal of Nutrita was to help people track aspects of their diet that were going to help them, unlike calorie tracking, which is not a good strategy for long-term sustainable fat loss. Nutrita basically gave people an insulin index. So that means that it was helping them identify the foods that would raise their insulin, which is a fat-storing hormone and a key metabolic regulator. And the idea was that people are eating insulinogenic foods, and we wanted them to choose foods that were going to stimulate their insulin less. So on the surface of it, that's fine, but it gets very, very, very complicated because there are foods which will raise your insulin acutely, like protein, which is not harmful, because it's also raising other hormones like glucagon, GLP-1, and other things that modulate this insulin response. And it's not going to lead you into hyperinsulinemia because you're eating lots of steak. No one gets, too much insulin from steak, yet acutely you do see a rise in insulin. So even though we chose to use the insulin index, we knew that it was limited, but we thought it was an improvement on what was offered, which is basically calorie intake. So we wanted to improve it. We also devised a nutrient density score. And this was was my personal favorite because it was a way to cut through a lot of the myths about plants being the most nourishing foods that we can choose. And in fact, it's quite the opposite. Plants are not the most nourishing foods we can choose. That is animal source foods, at least for humans. And it was my way of getting people to eat more animal foods and obtain more micronutrients that were going to make them healthy. And of course, combined with the insulin index, it was going to help them, reduce their carbohydrate intake and basically lower the amount of insulin they produce. So both scores were meant to work together to help people eat more animal foods, lower their carbs, and that was supposed to help them, achieve better health. Now, unfortunately, it's a business venture. It was my first business venture, and it didn't work out. We tried. We got an app out there, but it wasn't that successful. There's a lot of things that we could have done better. You're young, inexperienced. The team is not in the same office together. We're each in different countries. It didn't work out, but it really taught me a lot about food scores because it made me pay attention to the limitations. And this is why I've been so vocal about the satiety per calorie score that we've seen, become really popular recently this last year. And so I think in principle, it's clear that I have nothing against food scores. I think we should keep trying to develop them. We need to make things numerical for people so that they can, assess and compare and replicate different self-experiments they're doing. But I think we have to be very humble in how much we don't know and how much those food scores can mislead people. And having tried to create one myself, I know how easily you can be misled by them and how you need to narrow their scope. I think this may be the most important thing. If you're going to develop a food score, try not to make it, give you the instructions on everything you should be doing in your diet. You should have it narrow with a narrow scope so that you don't, overpromise, but rather underpromise and overdeliver. That would be a good food score.
Well, just as a side note, I have to say that you even attempting a business startup is a success, regardless of whether it's still around or not. I think it's always a success to follow your passions and try something that nobody else is doing. So I do think that's successful. And now we are getting over to Diet Doctor. And before we kind of get into this, I just have to say, I love Diet Doctor. I love Diet Doctor. This was one of the websites I found very early in my low carbohydrate journey. It is the most wonderful resource for finding recipes, finding meal plans, finding education, the videos, movies that you could buy. You could create your own meal plans. There was a whole back page index that would send you to other websites that were doing awesome work. It was such a cool thing. And I just have to say, like, as the gym that we were working at, they were doing weight loss contests that we had to do every 3 months. It was a 2-month contest we'd have to fill. We'd have to give people the information that the gym would give them about proper nutrition and all the recipes and whole grains and fruits and vegetables and all this other stuff. And when we found low carb, we found a whole different system that we could bypass whatever the gym was doing and just do our own thing. And we started using Diet Doctor meal plans. And all I would do with the cohort of the people that we would have is I would just say, here are these meal plans, find recipes that you love, eat as much of these as you like, and let's see how you do in 60 days. We had much better compliance percentage than the gym's average. The gym average compliance for that contest, somewhere around 15%. Our compliance percentage was up around about 67%. And the numbers that we ended up testing this on a body fat scale for a total of 126 people. The weight that was lost between those 126 people in 60 days was 735 pounds. And the percentage of that weight that came from fat was 720.9 pounds. We were getting people to lose nearly 100% of their weight from fat simply by giving them Diet Doctor meal plans and teaching them in a few seminars, like a few cool things about, low carbohydrate. The people to run Diet Doctor, Andreas Einfeld is the big one. I've met him at Low Carb Denver. He is as kind as he is tall. The dude is very, very tall. One of the kindest humans ever. So this is no knock on them or anything that they're doing. When you found out that they were doing some type of food scoring system, what was your first reaction?
Well, the food scoring system, as far as I understand it, was the brainchild of people outside of Diet Doctor initially. I think it was now I'm trying to get my history right here. I think it was Brian Sanders who originally came up with the satiety per calorie score. And I think Ted had the protein to energy ratio. And somehow this protein to energy ratio got like transmogrified into satiety per calorie. It's sort of the version 2.0 of the protein to energy ratio. And this, I think, really appealed to Andreas Einfeld because he experimented with a higher protein version of low carb and lost, a little bit of extra weight that he has. He's certainly not someone who's overweight, but he probably leaned out just by reducing some of the fat and increasing the protein, which is actually not surprising at all in lean people. I mean, I can see it in myself. If I lower my fat intake, increase my lean protein intake, I'm certainly gonna, lean out. You're gonna see my abs even more. Now, I might not want to do that because I might, not have enough energy to do CrossFit and to work and to be a dad and do all the things I want to do. But it's true. I certainly can lose a bit of body fat doing this. So I'm not surprised at all by that result. But in people who are overweight, it doesn't always work like that. It does for a considerable number of people. In fact, even today, I do tend to recommend people who stall on their fat loss journey. I will tell them that you can certainly experiment dropping the fat and increasing the protein. I don't see a problem with that. I think that's perfectly reasonable. Lots of people have found success with that. That's great. But that's not everyone. And there's a considerable amount of people who have tried this and who have failed. And I think that it's not fair to them to sort of push them out of the conversation, out of the belief that, well, if it hasn't worked, they're probably cheating. They're just eating fat. They don't realize they're just eating too much. And I think when we do that, we're committing the same mistake from the sort of mainstream health advice that low carb was a response to. So that's where my personal disappointment in this approach comes, not because the approach is advocating for more protein, less fat. That's totally fine. That's a great option. Is that this approach excludes the other option, which is some people can overcome their fat loss stall by increasing the relative percentage of fat and doing this at the expense of protein. That is a fact. People have done this. It has worked for them. I know quite a few of them personally. I've seen them in real life. I've spoken with them many, many times. And I've also witnessed it myself with an ex that I had a few years ago. I was sitting next to her 6 months in a row, once when she tried the high protein version first, because that's what I had actually recommended first to her. It didn't work. Then I recommended a higher fat version, still didn't work. Still wasn't losing the fat. So I've seen both modalities fail. And once you've seen the people, eaten the meals with them, they're not cheating. What do you have to, you just have to accept the reality that's in front of you and be like, okay, there's something we don't understand here. It's not simply about restricting fat. We knew very well that fat doesn't simply make you fat. That was, the whole premise of the low carb movement. But I think there's a big contingent in that movement who sort of forgotten this basic message and have sort of, I think, floated back into this comfort zone of saying, well, it does come down to energy balance. You should just eat less fat. You can't just magically have, more energy dense foods and not gain weight. And I think when they say this, they're just forgetting all of the counter examples. We have lots of people who can, be on a ketogenic diet, which is extremely energy dense by definition, because fat is the principal macronutrient in a ketogenic diet, and they can achieve a lot of success. So if they've achieved success initially and they've stalled, it's not necessarily because they're still eating too much fat. There are a whole host of reasons that could be the case. Some people start taking glucocorticoids, right? And they start storing more fat. Some people get a gut infection. Something changes in their microbiota, their inflammatory profile, and they gain more fat. And they gain more fat on the very same diet in which they were having tons of success beforehand. So I think this is where I take issue with a lot of the arguments made by Ted Naiman and Andreas Einfeld, because I think they're failing to recognize that the experience of these people is equally true as all the other anecdotes that we can point to where people have had success by reducing fat and increasing protein. And I was very, very clear with them on Twitter multiple times when I said, do you even offer a higher fat version as an option? I'm not saying it has to be your first option, not saying it has to be something you emphasize, but is it at least an option? And it is not. They've been very clear with me multiple times. This is not an option for them. This is where they lost me. And this is why I've been so vocal against this concept, because I think it's, although they are marketing it as we're broadening the amount of things people can eat, right? That is the argument of SPC. They say low carb works for some people, but we want to do something a bit different where you can have more dietary choices. It's less restrictive, but you can achieve the same results, maybe even better, right? That is what they've said multiple times. But why? How can that be true if you're removing a very basic option that has basically always been an option in the low carb space? We used to tell people, experiment. Some people would say, no, experiment first with more fat. That's really important because fat is really satiating. Other people would say, no, you have to try high protein first. That's super satiating. You have to do that. And I'm agnostic about which one is going to work best. I don't think we have the trials to demonstrate this. In fact, I know because I've looked and I've checked and I've asked Ted and Andreas to share trials, and they never share trials that are actually designed to answer the question that they are supposedly asking. It's trials that are answering something parallel, something similar, right? And this is where I think we need to sort of come back to basics and realize we don't have those questions yet. We don't know the effects of protein. We cannot extrapolate, the effects of protein on a mixed diet to the ketogenic state, which is very different. And we cannot, conflate someone whose intake from protein, half of it is coming from plants, versus someone's protein intake is coming from animals. It is not the same quality of protein. It is not the same food with which that protein is coming. So we have lots of unanswered questions that are really, really fascinating. And I think we do people a disservice when we pretend we have more answers than we do. And that is essentially the problem I have with the approach. It's the claims don't fit the data that we currently have.